Hello, my name's Patricia Moats. I'm known as Tish. I was born in on Entry Mountain, and I was a home birth. I am the daughter of Mary and Virginia Merritt, and my father was William Lee Wright. I don't know much about my father's side. Um, I mean, I know who they were, but I don't really know a lot about them. But my mother's side, I know a lot about. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, which was Martha Jane Merritt. And my grandfather was Henry Oliver Merritt, and he was from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. They met in Wheeling, West Virginia. Um, in I don't know, it was like, and my grandmother was the granddaughter of Melinda Emanuel, which was a free woman. Her father was the white slave owner, and he released her mother, Melinda's mother, and her brother before he passed because he knew his wife would not free them. Um, so he did that, and he gave her land on Entry Mountain, and then her daughter, Alice uh, Lindsay, her and her husband, she was married to John Lindsay, and they accumulated more land on Entry Mountain. So I know some of the history. I don't know, like my grandmother Alice's people. I know she had a sister named Lucy, but I know, and they migrated to Dayton, Ohio. But I don't know a lot about them. I don't know, where they went from there, and their children. And my daughter, that's getting married next week, she has done some study, and she's found a couple of relatives that, from there. So I don't know. I'd like to know more. I'd like to know more about, where they're at now, and how my grandmother got all the land. My mother was Mary and Virginia Merritt, and my father was William Lee Wright.
And what did they do for a living?
My father, for years, only came home on the weekends and stuff because he was a taxi driver. He worked away. Mom was always a homemaker. Um, my father died when I was 13. Well, a week before my 13th birthday. Um, but Mom was always, yeah, she was just a homemaker. She was a very strong-willed woman. So, but yeah.
What are some of your earliest memories of your mom?
Um, there's nothing that she couldn't do. She did plumbing work. She did gardening work. You name it, Mom did it. And like I say, I was one of the three younger ones, so I was 13. But you know, um, with Dad working away as a taxi driver, uh, it left all the responsibility, and she had 9 children. She had 10 children. My brother died when he was a couple days old, so she had 10 births and 9 children that she pretty much raised on her own because, like I said, he worked away. There wasn't work around here, farm work, but not enough to sustain a family. So he worked away. You say driving the taxi, and then I guess I was maybe 4 or 5 when he got sick and he moved home, and he was home from that time on, and he worked. Um, at that time, when he first moved home, he just worked on farms because there really wasn't anything to do around here. Then he went away and to school, and he came back, and he was a mechanic for several years, and then he went to work on the state road. Um, And during that time, working on the state road, something caught a fire. I don't know if it was the truck or something caught a fire. And he was standing on the other side. And the guy who sprayed the stuff said he didn't know Dad was on the other side. And he was sick after that. It just went downhill. My dad could not, toward the end, he could not lay down to sleep. The only sleep he got was on his knees with his head laying in a chair. I remember when he passed, they did an autopsy, not because Mom requested one, it was because they had no idea out at Morgantown really what caused him to be so sick and why, his his death. But they said his insides were burnt. Like I say, I was 12 years old, the week before my 13th birthday when he died. But Mom was a strong woman. She raised us. I mean, she was very strict, but you were loved, and she always wanted the best for us. So, I have no complaints as far as I had a wonderful mother. She made our childhood. We didn't have much, but I look back now and I didn't realize we didn't have much because she made it feel like we had everything, and I knew she went through things that she never talked to us about. But as I grew up and had kids of my own, I look back and I said, she went through this stuff, but she never let us know she was going through this. So, I had a wonderful childhood. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. We called her Granny, Martha Jane Merritt, and she was special too. But I had a lot of strong women in my life that never gave up, and so I try to follow that even to this day. I think back when I think about things I go through and I'm thinking, oh, this is bad, but they were strong. They were strong women. My mom had, there were 7 of them. And I guess Mom was like 13 or 14 when my granny decided that she was moving back to Entry Mountain. She was moving back to West Virginia. Well, she was in West Virginia. But she moved back from Marietta, Ohio. But she moved back without my grandfather. And she finished raising her children there. But my mom had one brother that was, I think he was 30-something when he was killed. He was in a car with a group of people. I don't know where they were going. And the one guy had a gun. They claim it accidentally went off, but he was killed. And then she had another brother, Charles Edwin, that I guess maybe the age of 18. He was arrested for supposedly attacking this woman. It was a girl, even though he said that he didn't do it, and the girl said he didn't do it. They still brought him up on charges. And I remember Mom saying that her brother Marvin came from out Marlington when it was, because it was so bad that when the girl's mother brought her to the courthouse to say, number one, this was not the person, and number two, the person who was talking to her was just talking. They didn't try to do anything to her. They didn't want to hear her. So they said it was so bad they were going to move him to Petersburg. And so my Uncle Marvin and a bunch of men drove up to Franklin and followed them because they didn't want him lynched. But in the meantime, after they moved him, the Klan burnt a cross at the road at my grandmother's driveway. They woke up in the middle of the night. They were already asleep. They woke up in the middle of the night and the cross was burning. And they didn't know if the house was surrounded. So they went out the back and up through the woods and over to a neighbor's house. And I know that affected my mom for years. It affected my granny for years. But they lived through it. My uncle got out. No charges was brought because the girl, like the girl said, when it went to trial, he wasn't the guy that was talking to her, and he, it wasn't him at all. And on top of that, she said, I wasn't touched. But yeah, that's a lot. And he came back, and at that time there was a theater in Franklin, and he went to the movies a couple weeks later, but he said he just kept feeling people watching him, so he left. He left and went to Dayton, Ohio, because it seemed like everybody in that family, the Emanuel family, the Lindsay's family, they migrated to Dayton, Ohio. So he went there and was there with, and he got married and lived the rest of his life. And then my other uncle that was younger, a couple years younger, he left and went out there. So the only one that actually stayed here in Franklin area was my mom and my Aunt Patty. But yeah, there was so much. And when I went to school, I guess I'd heard all this stuff, and I didn't let it affect me. There were you knew that there was prejudice, but you dealt with it a little differently because there were more of us and we stuck together more. And I see the kids now, because so many people have left this area, and we only come back like for homecomings, or we come back to visit, but we don't live here. And the young people that's here now don't understand, and I know they face a lot of prejudice. My children, when they went to school, faced more prejudice than I think I did. And I think the reason they did was because there was so few of them. When I was going to school, there was more. There were more people that lived here in Moatstown. There was, more people lived on Entry Mountain, but as years went by, people left. When I grew up, there were so many more black families living here in Moatstown, on Entry Mountain. There was just so many more of us. So, and we stuck together. Even if we had issues with each other, when we were out and someone came against one, we banded together. But even like when my children went to school, they didn't have that because there were so few of blacks in the county. They didn't have the power, because I think when you band together, you have that bond and it's stronger in you, but when you don't have, I mean, my son the girl liked him, and he liked this girl. Her father threatened him on the school ground. It was even it was just so bad in the school. It was the teachers, that were, and we didn't really have that. Like I say, when I was in school, we didn't have that. But when my older three were in school, it was bad. It was bad. When they were doing when they combined the school, Circleville, they closed Circleville and they built a new Pendleton High School in Franklin. They hung dolls, black dolls, They hung them from, from the ceiling in the gym. They did all that. I didn't experience it. Um, I I was out of school, and my kids were really young when the Klan came again into the county, and they would leave, their little stickers everywhere, but they didn't stay like they did when they burnt the cross for my uncle. They because the blacks banded together, and then there was also whites that supported the blacks, so they didn't stay. The churches during that time, when my kids were little, they 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 preached against it. So it didn't stay as long. But it was felt because, like I say, they had their stickers everywhere. They would call people. They were showing up. They didn't burn the crosses, but they would show up with the hoods on and stuff like that. Um, and I know a lot of the couples that were interracial. Um, I mean, they had a bad time of it during that time. So
Around what time was that?
then in the 70s, my oldest was born in 77. So I want to say the late 70s, early 80s. It was bad at that time, but then it got better. I won't say it got better. It was not so blatant. Now I feel like they don't do the cross burning. They don't do that stuff, but it's more subtle. It's like buying up the land and taking. If they take the land from us, then that means we can't. They can't come back. And it's going to turn into a strictly white community. That's how I feel. I think they do it that way now instead of like coming out and like scaring with the Klan and different things like that. But it's still there. The racism is still there. It's just not blatant. It's just they realized they couldn't do it one way, so they do it another, and they are running us out. They a lot of the older ones, like, we're trying to hold on to the land, but some of the younger people don't understand what their forefathers and the grandmothers and the grandfathers, what they went through to get the land and to keep the land. um, that's and I think they're using that. They're using that. They're using the fact that, and there isn't anything around here to draw the young people and to keep them here. There isn't anything. I remember when I was a kid in Franklin, and when we had the bowling alley, we had the teen center, we had the movie theater, we had the drive-in, we had like 3 grocery stores, and now the Franklin is down to 1 grocery store, and we had 3 new car dealerships. We don't have any now. It was like there was, instead of Franklin progressing and Pendleton County progressing, we regressed, because none of the things that I had when I was growing up, and even when my mom was young, they're not there. I mean, the theater's gone. The car dealerships are gone. The grocery stores are gone. We're down to 1. We had clothing stores, but then we don't have none of that stuff now. So I think a lot of that, the economic thing, it hit the white community too, but it hit the black community worse. And they went from there used to be, I want to say, maybe 20 families that lived here in Moatstown. I mean, I wasn't from here, but I've heard once I married into the family, the talk about um, you know, there was a lot of families up here. But there's, now there's like maybe 3. They're coming back. They're coming back slowly, but they're coming back. But before, just say last year, there was only 4 families, 3 families that lived in Moatstown on a regular. I mean, we lived here. They were here. They lived here. There was only 3 families. Same thing with Entry Mountain. When I was a kid, I mean, we had a whole bus, and it just came to Entry Mountain. And there's mostly Entry Mountain now is older people, and you can probably count the kids on one hand that go to school.
When did people start leaving?
I think like on Entry Mountain, I know it was like maybe in the 50s, early 60s. But there was still a lot even when I was there. But then by the time I got to high school, most of the people had left because of jobs. So a lot of them moved to Stanton, to Harrisonburg. Some moved to just, further up north. But they had moved. And it's just very few people, left. But the county on a whole, I think, like I said, it's regressing and it's dying out. We're soon going to be nothing but a retirement community. Because I know even a lot of the children, the kids that I went to school with, most of them moved away. There are very few. I can count the ones on 2 hands of the class that I graduated with that stayed here in the county because of jobs. If you lived here, you worked in Harrisonburg or you worked in Moorfield, you had to travel. And so it was just, if you have a family, you want to see your family and be part of their lives. And especially if both parents work, it was so much easier to move your family there. Because, it's, but I think that's what happened to a lot. But I also think that with that came the fact that they could move the black communities out, because we had to move away to be able to take care of our families. I guess me and my sister were the only ones who never actually moved away. My husband drove to Harrisonburg, actually on the other side of Harrisonburg to Elkton, Virginia for 20 years. Because there wasn't any, work around here. But he didn't want to move because he thought this was a good place. And we differ on that. I was born and raised here. He was not. He came to visit. So we have a different perspective. We're 3 years apart in age, but what he sees here in West Virginia is different than my views of West Virginia, because he came and visited during the summer and he seen all the good stuff. He didn't really have to deal with the racism and, people calling you names, or you making the top grades in your class, but you were not recognized because you were black. You knew you made better grades than this person, but they got the recognition because they were white. That was something, and you had to deal with that. And you not to be angry all the time, because that defeats the purpose. And I was taught that by my mother years ago. You can't do that, because that destroys you. It doesn't bother them, it destroys you. So you got to let go of that anger and move on. You got to know that within yourself that you are good, that you're doing the best you can, and you are good. But they never, when I was in school, they never gave you that, that recognition. They never let you think, okay, you did better. But, you knew that you did better than that other person. But that other person got the praise. But you have to go on, move on from that, because you can't, because it'll destroy you from within if you do. But my husband and I have different viewpoints, because we have had a different relationship than what other people had, because he sees it from, oh, it's so wonderful and this place is so, but he didn't have that day-to-day thing of dealing with. But with my children, it's not the same. My children's, I think they had a good childhood, but it was overshadowed by that so blatant racism. Like I say, and it was worse with them than it was with me, but I think it was because, like I say, there were more of us. But I think a lot of the fact that the Moatses were so much, they were lighter people, and I think that they didn't experience because they fitted in more. Only the people who knew that they were black or descended from blacks would say. But if they walked in and you didn't know, they were descended from, you would know. And most of the ones on Entry Mountain did. Like on Entry Mountain, I remember my mother talking about there were a lot of people. There were carters, and they moved. They moved to California. The one son did, and then he came back and he got his parents, and he moved them because of that. But they were darker people. So yeah, I think a lot of more people on Entry Mountain experience racism than in Moatstown because of their complexion.
Do you know how Entry Mountain, how that community was formed, and like when it was formed or anything like that?
I don't, like I said, I don't know about the rights, um, but the the Conrad man that owned, well, that was Melinda's father. He gave her that land. He gave her land up on Entry Mountain. She married a black man, um, very dark skinned black man. Um, Now, and the other family that was up there was the Willises, and Lorena, I think it was Lorena, I think that was her name. Her father was a Dr. Hopkins from Upper Track, which is, just 12 miles or so down the road from Franklin. And he gave her that land um, up there. I think she was a Douglas. I think that's what her mother's name was. But her mother, and I don't know if her mother was a slave or whether her mother, was just black and had a child by Dr. Hopkins. But from what I understand, there were several, he was married, but he had several children, not only with the black woman, but he also had several children by other women. Um, and they know that they're related. But yeah, so that's how that part. I'm not sure how all where the rights came from. I don't know. That part I don't know. Um, but um, the Willises, I do know that Dr. Hopkins gave her the land, and the Conrad man gave Melinda and the land up there.
Do you have any idea like what time period that was?
Um, it was before the Civil War. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it was before because after the Civil War they would have been free. So it had to be way before that. But I never understand. I don't know where um, Melinda's brother went. I was told by my grandmother that he went for white, but I don't know. Later years, I heard that he died young, but I'm not really sure where, that came in at.
Do you know where they're buried at?
Melinda is buried in Dayton, Ohio. When Aunt Lucy, which was my grandma Alice's sister, they were Melinda's daughters. Um, Aunt Lucy had a house on Entry Mountain, actually up there where the cemetery is and where most of my grandma Alice's people were buried. I'm assuming it was a cemetery of their people too, because she had a house close to the cemetery, and she owned a cemetery, and her house burnt. And when her house burnt, Grandma Alice let her live in her house. But then after a while, Aunt Lucy went to Dayton because she had family in Dayton. So she went to Dayton. And they left. Melinda was here for a while, but then they came and took Melinda out to Dayton. And she lived out there for years, they said. And she fell down one of those, where they had the door in the floor and you go down into the cellar, whatever. Somebody left a door open and she fell. And she lived for several months after that, but she passed. So she's buried out in Dayton, Ohio. A lot of, like say my uncles, my Uncle Dewey and my Uncle Edwin and my Uncle Arnold they migrated. When they left here, they went to Dayton. And that's where they were married and raised their children. And I don't even know a lot of them. I do know I know my cousins, my first cousins, but I don't know their children because, people grow up and we just don't, you just don't stay connected. So, and I miss that because this last year, when we were young, I had a cousin that we were very close, and she passed. And I'm like, every year I kept saying, after when my kids were little, I'm like, I didn't have the time. But then when they grew up, I'm like, I need to contact Wanda. I need to get back in contact with her. And I regret never doing that because when we were little growing up and they'd come and spend the summer, several weeks in the summer, it was like we were so close. But, life got in the way, and then she passed to cancer. And I'm like, I didn't get to know her kids or her grandkids. And I feel bad about that. And that's the reason I'd like for the families to come together so we can be together at all times. It's like we need each other. We need to know where we come from, and we need to keep that bond because, like I said, even when I was back in school, I realized that if we as blacks stayed together, we could conquer anything. We got through, and we didn't have as much tension from, we didn't have, but like I say, my kids didn't have that because there was only a few of them. Like I had several, blacks in my class when I was going to school. But my daughter, in some of her classes, she was the only black, and in some years she was the only one in her class, in the whole. So it was bad. It's kind of hard to stand up against racism by yourself, but you can if you stand together with someone.
What church did you go to, and what role did the church play in your family and in your community?
Well, when I was real little, we went to Emmanuel Chapel. But my mom was my mom was different. She was always looking for something, but there was a minister there that he was a African Methodist minister for years, but then he moved to the Church of God, and so mom, but for years he moved to Martinsburg, West Virginia, and he would come twice a month to mom's house, and we had church in our house for years. And but then he finally died, and so then my sister Teresa had gone to pastor in Petersburg. She went to church down there. So then eventually after a year, my other sister went, and then my mom went. So I heard this pastor preach. He came to Moats Chapel once. My husband invited him to come and preach, and he was so genuine, and I just felt like he was such a man of God that I started going down there too. So that's where I go. I go to Petersburg now to church. Our pastor just had his 98th birthday. So that's where I go now. But I went to, when I was little, we went to Emmanuel Chapel. Yeah.
Where is that?
It's on Entry Mountain. I think it's underneath another name, but as far as I'm concerned, it'll always be Emmanuel Chapel. It was named for Melinda Emanuel. So, actually, I think she was the first. She was the first up on Entry Mountain. She was the first up on Entry Mountain, and it just different ones came in. But what people don't understand is for years, even after the Civil War, in the early 1900s, there were several families that lived in Franklin, in the town of Franklin. Prominent people. They were blacksmiths. I do remember I had a teacher once told me that the bell on the Methodist church was brought in by a black guy. They came and I think he was the blacksmith. They lived in Franklin. I went to Franklin Elementary School. The school that I went to, the Franklin Elementary, was built over a black cemetery. There is a white cemetery beside of it, and I mean dates back to the pre-Civil War. A lot of them, I think, are even back to like the 1700s. But the black cemetery, I don't know how the town acquired the land. I don't know any of that. But some of the graves, the families could move them. They had money to move them. Other ones they didn't. So they just built the elementary school over the black cemetery. And that always amazed me. Because I'm like, they preserved their cemetery, but they didn't, they didn't. And I'm sure there was other land in Franklin that they could have built the elementary school, but why did you have to build it over the black cemetery? But like I say, there was so many people, blacks in Franklin. And I'm taking around maybe the 1920s, 1930s is when they migrated and they left, because you ended up with just a few families that was up on Entry Mountain. And there were also over Circleville, there were also black families over there. And there used to be a bus line that went from Franklin to Elkins and that over there. But there were black families during my mother's childhood. There were black families over there too. But they just got absorbed into the community over there. Bill Lindsay, William Lindsay, Renee, and Ricky's father. His father was my mother's uncle. He had land over there in Circleville. He owned land over in Circleville. But when he died, Bill Lindsay's mother was a Moats, and she died in childbirth, shortly after childbirth. So, but when he died, I think he was maybe 3 when he came to live with the Moatses, and then they sold the land over there, because at that time, there wasn't any black, communities or black people living over there, so they sold the land. But there was a lot of blacks in Franklin. I always wanted to know where they went, but there's no really way to trace them because I know it was after the Civil War, but they just didn't what you call. And I always wondered if there was a black cemetery where the elementary school was built, then where were they had to have black people in the town, and so I don't know.
Were there ever any black-owned businesses?
On Entry Mountain, there was Claude Willis or Claude Douglas. I'm not sure if he was Claude Douglas or Claude Willis, but I think it was Claude Douglas. He owned a store on Entry Mountain. I know that Theodore Willis, before he went into the military, maybe even after, he actually made shoes. I mean, actually did the whole making, everything. He did that, but then, like to say, it wasn't really enough to make it. So then he left. My uncle, John Arnold Merritt, he didn't own the business, but he ran the dry cleaners. A man named, I don't know what his real name was, but they called him Hun Simmons. He owned it, but he didn't do anything. My uncle ran it for years, but then he went out to Dayton too. But like I say, I remember I had a teacher, her name was Elizabeth Boggs, and she was the one who really got me interested in the black history there in Franklin because she would tell me stories. And I wish that I had recorded them or wrote them down, the stories that she told me, because she knew a lot of the black people that lived in Franklin. And like I say, when I was a kid, she was old. She was like in her 70s maybe when I was a kid. But she would tell me these stories about the different blacks that lived and what they did. I mean, I know there was a blacksmith, and she would just, different ones that she would tell me about, and even what their names were. I think he was a minister, he was a pastor, but he was black. So he had to have a church, but it wasn't up on the mountain, on Entry Mountain, so it had to be in Franklin. And he had twin boys, and she knew their names. But I look back on it now, and I'm like, I wish I'd have wrote that down. Kids, I think of all the stories that when I was spent, because when I was little, I went every Friday evening. I got out of school and I went to my granny's and I stayed until Sunday evening. And it's like, and all the stories that she told me over the years, and I'm thinking, and some of them, if I hear something, my cousin would say something, I'm like, I remember Granny telling me that story. But over the years, you sort of just put it in the back of your mind, and you don't remember it. But I wish I had written them down, and I wish that I had before my mom got to the point where she couldn't speak, that I had had listened, had her talk more, and wrote those stories down, because they were interested, and they made those experiences they had made them who they were, and they made us who we are because they raised us. There was a big Native American heritage, and I do believe that they had Native American blood in them. But at that time, I remember my grandmother saying, at that time, back then, you could a black could own land, but a Native American couldn't. Not here in this county. So a lot of them that were Native American said they were black.
So, Entry Mountain was known as the black community over there, and Moatstown was known as the black community over here. Is that right? Or
Mm-hmm.
had their okay?
Mm-hmm.
So they were At one time, Intermountain was pretty much all black. There weren't any white folks over there.
Right.
Okay, and same with Moatstown.
Well, as a lady once said, this is a white lady, said, when the Moats became black, most of the Moatses, they weren't black in the beginning. They, and my husband knows the story about when they came over. They came. They came over. They paid their passage over to America, and then they got what you call it into being indentured servants. Then they finally, I guess they finally got what you call it, but they weren't. They were Dutch. They were German Dutch. They weren't um, they weren't black. They were white. They married, and I can't say that they married uh, black people. Um, but you see, some of them was real fair. Um, I know I've seen pictures of Miss Alice, which she was real fair. She was German, and just she was a big. I mean, she was white. There was nothing black about her. But her husband looked Native American, dark, but he didn't look black. He looked Native American. Um, so I don't know. They for a long time they were. It wasn't until later years that they became more colored, with more color, with darker. But most of them were very fair people, um, and the ones who weren't looked more Native American. I remember um, there was a lady that lived. She lived on Entry Mountain, but she was from Moatstown. Her brother was a pastor, Reverend Boyd. Um, Miss Diana um, always said that she was Native. She said she was Native American. She looked Native American. She didn't look black to me. She looked Native American. Um, but I don't know who her husband, Mr. Ernest, was a tall, light skinned man, but I don't know where he came from. Um, but yeah, there was a difference. There was a difference. Now my grandmother, like I say, Melinda was white. Well, she was mixed, but yeah, it was more like the ones on Entry Mountain were more. They had color, and the ones in Moatstown didn't.